Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our participants. This is the closing keynote of the IUSSP conference. Today we are welcoming François Bourguignon, who will speak about the title of his keynote is Panel versus Cross-Sectional Data in the Social Evaluation of Economic Growth. We'll have two discussants, Marcello Neri and Abina Odura, whom I will introduce later. Just in a few words, I will present François, even though he doesn't need to be presented. But of course, François, you were the chief economist of the World Bank for a few years, but also the director of the Paris School of Economics. I will not describe your complete works, but just to say that you brought the inequality topic within development banks and development agencies, a very important contribution. I did not introduce myself, but I am Thomas Melogno, the head of research at AFD, and I can testify that recently we integrated within our strategy the reduction of inequalities. And today you will expand on your previous work and talk not only about static inequality, but also dynamic inequality and mobility, obviously something very different, but relevant to today's discussion. My job will be easy, but I will be a very tight timekeeper. François has constraints, and we all do have constraints. So again, I would like to thank the organizers for associating AFD with today's events. And without further delay, I will leave the floor to François, and then we'll have questions and comments from Abina and Marcello. So François, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I will simply ask whether I can share my screen. That seems to be okay.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, fine. Okay. So it's a real pleasure to be here, I'll say behind my mic or behind my screen today to give this last keynote of this conference. I'm really only sorry that this can only be virtual. I think that we would all like to have had it on an in-person basis. So before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote. And also I would like to really tell the management of IUSSP how inspired they were in creating this poverty and inequality segment of the union, because certainly these two dimensions are absolutely crucial in studying a population. This is a very important angle for population studies. And unfortunately, I think that we would all agree with the fact that it is still more the case today with these pandemics than it is the case in general. And I didn't think about this before preparing this keynote, but the topic I will be talking about today would, as a matter of fact, be extremely relevant in those pandemic days, in the sense that we are interested definitely by what is going on with every individual in society, the way in which they are affected by the pandemic or by all the measures to fight the pandemic. And this is really partly what I will be talking about. I will be talking about methodology to a large extent, but I hope that this will convince you that there are many applications that can be done. I will be also applying what I will say to the US, basically because it is a country, as you know, where there is plenty richness of data, but presumably this may be applied to other countries. I should also mention that this is a paper which has been written, or this is more than a paper, it is really a reflection which has been going on for quite some time with a young Israeli colleague, Jonathan Berman, who spent some time in the Paris School of Economics and who is now working at the London Mathematical Laboratory. So let me move on. Why do we, the fact that we want to evaluate economic growth, or with the reference I just made to pandemics, economic change in general. We want to know whether this is what is the change that is taking place in terms of income is good or is bad. And typically what we listen to when we refer to growth is that the bottom 50%, for example, of people got so much of the total income growth in society. Typically in the US, there's been a big fuss about the fact that over the last 30 years, 40 years here, the bottom of the distribution got only 13%. The bottom half got 13% of the whole additional pie that was made available by economic growth. And the very top got a disproportionately high share of that additional pie. Now, the point that if we try to think about this, the result of this kind of comparison over time will depend very much on the kind of data that we use. If we're using cross-sectional data, repeated cross-sections, as household surveys, which are available every year in the US and in most countries, most advanced countries today, every year, in many developing countries at regular time intervals. Then what we're doing, we're simply comparing in an anonymous way two populations. But now if we have panel data, which are following by definition people over time, then we can keep track of the people and follow them and make a statement about who is benefiting from growth in a non-anonymous way. And this is a big distinction that I will make throughout all this lecture between anonymous ways of looking at change in the distribution of income and non-anonymous way. So the issue is, what is the difference that it makes when we look at one type of data or in one way to those data, or when we look at the other type of data, or we look at the data in a panel way. And in particular, we insist on an analytical instrument that is called the growth incidence curve, which has become quite popular over the last 15 years, more or less, and which I define right now. In an anonymous way, this growth incidence curve, which, by the way, were introduced in the literature by Ravalian and Chen, is that definition. We look at 2 points of time. We look at people who are ranked at rank P at time T prime. What is their income? This is quantile P. And we look at what is the income of those people who were ranked P at time T. And we look at the growth of that income. So this is a definition of the growth incidence curve. It is anonymous because we know that there is no reason for the people to be at P at time T prime to be the same as the people at T at time T. So to some extent, we are missing something because in between T and T prime, people may have moved a lot, and we are missing that. Now, those two periods are compared exactly in the same way as we would be comparing two countries. If we were to compare Guatemala with Philippines, we would do exactly the same thing. We will not care about who are the Guatemalans, I don't know how it is, what we should say, and the Filipinos. So we are doing exactly the same thing here. So somehow one has a feeling that we're missing an important dimension of the picture. This is very much the veil of ignorance that was introduced by Arsani and the Rawls. You look at societies not knowing where you will be in that society. It is exactly what is going on here. What is nice with the growth incidence curve is that there is a direct relationship with inequality measurement. In particular, if the growth incidence curve is downward sloping, meaning that the income growth rate is higher for low income than for high income, then you can prove very easily that the share of total income going to poor people is increasing at the expense of the share of income going to the rich people, meaning that whatever the inequality measure that you are using, you will be concluding that there is less inequality in that population. And from that point of view, a downward sloping growth incidence curve is a good thing. And an upward sloping curve is a bad thing from a social or social welfare point of view. If one now look at the non-anonymous curves, now the definition is rather obvious. We look at people who were ranked at time t, where they are the same people at time t prime. And this is what we call the non-anonymous growth incidence curve corresponding to rank P in the definition. So it is clear that if there is no re-ranking in the population, and if the population, of course, are the same, in between you may have new people coming in and you may have people coming out. I will not look into this issue right now. But if you have the same population, and if there is no re-ranking of the people, then the non-anonymous curve is the same as the growth incidence curve. This means that the non-anonymous is incorporating the anonymous growth incidence curve plus mobility. And this keynote will be about what can we do with this duality of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. Now, there is direct relationship between the non-anonymous growth incidence curve and income redistribution analysis, in the sense that in income redistribution or income or tax incidence analysis, we're looking at the way in which people income change when we change the income tax system. So this is exactly what we do here. Instead of looking at the income tax system, we look at the growth process. Now, what is the meaning of a downward sloping non-anonymous growth incidence curve? Then we would say that social welfare is improving provided that we agree on the fact that a given growth rate would be more valuable from a social point of view if applied to a poor person than if it were applied to a rich person, which is slightly different from what we do in standard inequality analysis. In inequality analysis, we say that $1 given to a poor person is worth socially more than $1 given to a rich person. Fine. But this does not imply anything in terms of 1% more for the poor person and 1% more for the rich person. So there is no clear social evaluation criterion in that case, even though we may believe or we may feel that it is better to have the 1% more among poor people. So I'll come back to that at the end. These are the anonymous and non-anonymous growth curves, growth incidence curve in the case of the United States between 1980 and 1990 for the whole population between 20 and 55, which means that we are following people until they are 65, because it is 55 in year 1920, and these are earnings, labor income. And then you see the obvious paradox, which is the fact that one curve is upward sloping, the blue curve for anonymous. By the way, the shaded area correspond to the confidence interval obtained through bootstrapping techniques. I'm not insisting on this. And the black curve is non-anonymous, and it is downward sloping. So if we believe that it is a good thing for poor people to have a higher rate of growth than rich people, then we have a paradox. And the issue is, what is the kind of welfare conclusion that we can get? So I will be developing this idea. First, I will say a few words about the fact that there is a lot of biases in this non-anonymous growth incidence curve that we have to take care of. Two, I want to insist on the duality of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve, mobility on the one hand, inequality on the other, then I want to propose a decomposition which is quite illuminating to understand the role of mobility and inequality. And finally, I want to say a few things about the social welfare criterion that one could use in order to evaluate a non-anonymous growth incidence curve, and in particular, the proporeness of those curves. So let me first talk about the issue of biases in the NAGIC, the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. There are some reasons to believe that there may be some bias toward the downward slope. First, we have to take care of the fact that maybe there is time heterogeneity. The curve I have shown for 80 to 90, sorry, may not be the same if we were to go from 2000 to 2010. So this is something that we'll check. Second, there may be a life cycle bias. Poor people, I mean, young people in general will be poorer than older people. But at the same time, poor people will see their income growing faster than older people. So here we may have a kind of systematic bias saying, okay, because you are including people at all ages, you have this kind of negative bias on the slope of the curve. But most importantly, there is an issue with measurement error. And the people who have worked not on intra-generational income mobility, but on intergenerational income mobility, know this problem very well. Because we observe initial income with noise, then we know that when we are regressing the today's income on the previous generation income, there is an attenuation bias. And this attenuation bias is basically introducing mobility where, as a matter of fact, there is no mobility. It's only a measurement error. How can we see what is the impact of those biases? On this chart, you have 2 dimensions. If we read this chart from top to bottom, these are different periods, different 10 years period, 68, 78, 80, 90, 2006, 2016. On the left-hand side, you have all the population, 20 to 55. And you can see that from a period to the next, there are not so many differences. We still have the downward sloping non-anonymous and the upward sloping anonymous. If you look at the middle, these are only for people who are between 35 and 40. So this is one way of correcting for this mixture of people of all ages and correcting for life cycle. And here you can see that definitely there are the shape of the NAGIC is changing over time. You have something which is downward sloping at the beginning and really at the middle. And you have something which is almost flat at the end. So we see that definitely there is some time variability of this concept, the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. Now, the last column is the same, except for the fact that we are looking at only full-time employed people, which means that we are taking away all those people who were working full-time in 1980, for example, and not working full-time in 1990. All those people who were not working or not working full-time in 80, but working full-time in 1990. So we're restructuring the sample. And not surprisingly, we see that the curve is still flatter. The non-anonymous growth incidence curve is still flatter. And again, with some changes over time, but basically with the flat or a downward sloping shape. So the fact that there is a discrepancy between the shape of the anonymous growth incidence curve and the non-anonymous one is not eliminated by this correction for the measurement error, which is obtained by simply averaging incomes over a 5-year period. Now, this may not be the right way to do that. There may be other ways, but experimenting with other ways, we find the same kind of result. Now, this, sorry, I made a mistake. This curve we obtained without any averaging. Now we're looking at the impact of averaging over 5 years, so trying to get rid of the measurement error. And now you can see that all the curves are becoming much flatter. All the non-anonymous growth incident curves are becoming much flatter. And if you look at the value of rho, which is at the top of each chart, which is a rank correlation of income between the initial and terminal years, then if you compare those two charts, you see that the rank correlation has increased enormously, basically because we got rid of the non-anonymous, of the measurement error. Now, you may understand why the measurement error plays a role in the non-anonymous growth incidence curve, basically because if you have somebody with who has a low income in the initial year, there is a high probability that this person has a low income because there is a negative measurement error. But if the measurement error is corrected 10 years later, you'll see a positive, a high growth rate for that person, which is due to the fact that the measurement error has disappeared. So now we understand why the non-anonymous growth incidence curve becomes much flatter. And to some extent, we see that in some cases, the shape is changing. For example, at the bottom on the middle, you see that you have a curve which is now slightly upward sloping. The same thing being true on the right-hand side. But when you look at all the people at the same time, when you don't correct for the life cycle, then we still have the downward sloping part. Now, if we look at the rank correlation, the row S in each table, we see that the difference between this and the previous table is that they are much higher, and they are extremely constant over time. And as a matter of fact, this is another finding of this analysis, is that we find that over time, when we are correcting for the measurement error after averaging, then we find that the variation over time of this rank correlation is very, very limited. And it is a very interesting, and this is true for all ages. It is also true when we look only at the 35, 40, whether they are full-time workers or full-time and part-time workers. So this is interesting in the sense that this shows that at least over a period of 40 years, there may not be very much difference in terms of rank mobility and implicitly in terms of the mobility due to, in terms of the change in the non-anonymous growth incidence curve due to mobility. And this is what drives me to my next point, which is to try to show what is the mobility and the cross-sectional content of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. And to do that, I will use a mathematical formulation. I swear that this is, now there will be a second equation, but this is the only one that, the first one of two equations that you'll see. So this is a definition of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve in mathematical terms using something called the copula. And the copula, which is this R PP prime function, simply is a rank transition matrix. It is a permutation matrix. It is the probability when you are rank P at the initial time T, you will be ranked P prime at time T prime. So think about the permutation matrix where you are simply permuting the rank of people. This is what RPP prime is. Now, why is it playing a role in the definition of synergic? In the following way. Initially, people at rank P have income YT of P. at time t prime, the expected value of the income of those people will be the probability that they will be at P prime time the income corresponding to rank P prime in the distribution at time T prime, which is YT prime of P prime. And if we sum over all the possible P prime, we'll get what is the income, what is the expected income, and therefore the expected growth rate of people who are at rank P at time T. So the reason why this is interesting is simply the fact that it shows clearly that the non-anonymous growth incidence curve depends on two ingredients, or maybe three if you want. One ingredient is the copula, which describes the mobility or the rank mobility dimension of the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. And the other one are the two cross-sectional distributions, or the marginal distributions of income in the initial period and the terminal period. So here we see very clearly what is behind the non-anonymous growth incidence curve. Now, based on this, and this was in the first set of slides that I sent to the discussants, and I apologize for changing my mind at the last moment, but based on this, it is possible to build synthetic panels, but I will not get into this issue here. What I want to do now is to decompose in a more systematic way the non-anonymous growth incidence curve into those two components, one due to mobility, the other one due to the change in the cross-sectional distribution. If we were to assume that the distributions, the joint distribution of income at time t and t prime is log normal, which is a very common assumption in theoretical work on the distribution, then we would have the whole thing, the whole dynamics described by three parameters: sigma t, the standard deviation of log income at time t; sigma t prime, the same thing at time t prime; and rho, the correlation between income at time t and income at time t, log income at time t, log income at time t prime. If you do that, then you can easily prove that the NAGIC will be upward sloping if this condition rho times sigma t prime is larger than sigma t. And the intuition of that is rather obvious. Say that you have sigma t prime much above sigma t. So inequality is increasing because there is more standard deviation. The standard deviation is higher in time t prime than in time t. Then if rho is high, then definitely the NAGIC will be increasing. But if rho is low, then rho is the inverse of mobility. So if rho is low, if there is a lot of mobility, this may compensate the fact that there is more inequality in a cross-sectional basis at time t prime than at time t. And based on this, it follows the following. If the growth incidence curve is downward sloping, that is, if sigma t prime is less than sigma t, less inequality, then because rho is less than 1, this cannot be, the condition that we have above cannot be true, meaning that the NAGIC is downward sloping too. If, on the other hand, you have that rho sigma t prime is larger than sigma t, that condition here is satisfied, then the NAGIC is upward sloping. But because rho is less than 1, then it is true that sigma t prime is above sigma t, which means that the growth incidence curve is upward sloping. In the other case, if the growth incidence curve is upward sloping, we don't know what happened to the non-anonymous, and vice versa. If the non-anonymous is downward sloping, we don't know what happens to the growth incidence, to the anonymous growth incidence curve. And those two cases, or this last case, is exactly what we find in the data. But let me be a bit more 5 or 10.
More than 5, François.
Okay, so quickly, let me explain you the decomposition here. Here you have the initial distribution. Here you have the new distribution, where you observe here that Y1 has gone here. Y1, person 1, is ranked at P in period T prime. So this is the point in the logic would be, the first point would be that the rate of growth of 1 is given by the difference between those two values. But we can decompose that change, the rate change, into two parts. We can repeat the initial distribution, YT, and we can say, okay, fine, let's say that we permute Y and P. So Y1 goes to P. And in a second stage, we change the value of income which corresponds to rank P at time T prime with respect to time T. So we have decomposed the total change in income into two parts, one which is due only to permutation, and the other one which is due only to the fact that at a given rank, the income is not the same in the initial and the terminal period. Now, this means that we can decompose the non-anonymous growth incidence curve into those two components. And this is what I will be applying now on the data. And this is what we get. First, we are able to show that the mobility term corresponding to that decomposition is always downward sloping. If you do permutation in in incomes, then you can show that in a rough way, the corresponding non-anonymous growth incidence curve will be downward sloping. It is basically because if you are among the poor, the only permutation that can do is with people richer than you, so you are gaining. And if you're among the top people, the only permutation you can do is with people poorer than you, so you are losing. This is the green curve that we have here. And the other one, which is called the shape term, which corresponds to the cross-sectional difference in distribution, is the purple one. And we see that the overall logic is the sum of those two terms. And we see here that we have compensation, which means that the dominant, no compensation, the dominant term is the green curve. Here we have almost compensation, which means that at the end, you see that the non-anonymous growth incidence curve is almost flat or somewhat upward sloping on the segment. And in the last one, you can see that sorry, I cannot see what is going on here. Right until the end, more or less, we have something that corresponds to that. Okay, one last point, and I'll be finished, and I will be skipping that. Simply no. I will have only one point here. Oh. This is it. When I'm saying that the non-anonymous growth incidence curve is downward sloping, you could see that it is not always okay. I mean, it is not true everywhere. What we have in mind is the bottom is higher than the top. But in the between, you may have any shape. And you can prove very easily that there is no regularity of those curves. So what is the meaning when we say that the curve is downward sloping? It is not very satisfactory. So we introduce another concept of monotonicity, which I will not detail here, but which leads to this generalized properness. And now we have something which is social welfare. The idea is saying that the curves will be downward sloping in the following sense, in the sense that the average growth rate of the P initialis poorest must be higher than the growth rate, the average growth rate of all the others, whatever P. So if you look at the whole distribution, you look at the value of P between 0 and 1, And you want to have that the mean of the growth rate on the left-hand part or the bottom part of the range, 0, 1, the bottom part below P, would be higher than the average of the top part, which is above P. So this is a kind of generalized proponest concept, which is much more fit to analyze the social welfare implication of income dynamics. And I will conclude on this. If you look at the mobility part in the decomposition that I have shown, then the proponents is always observed, and this is a property of this permutation process. And the black curve here is the mean of growth rate below the point on the horizontal axis, and the light curve is the mean growth rate of people above it. So you can see that whatever the division that you take, it is true that poorest people are faring better on average than richest people. And now if you apply that to the original non-anonymous growth curve, not only to the mobility part, then you get the top part, where you see that we don't have this property anymore. So we cannot say that there is a social welfare improvement. Only in one case, which is quite remarkable, which is between 2006 and 2016. Yes, we can say that for these people who these curves are referring to, that there was truly an improvement in the dynamics of income, and the mobility to some extent being compensating the negative impact of the more inequality. Now, I am out of time, so I'll stop here and I will refrain from any kind of conclusion. Sorry for being a bit late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, François, for almost holding your time. Now we're going to listen to Abina Oduro. Abina, you are the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ghana, also an Associate Professor at the Department of Economics. And I noticed you are the President of the International Association for Feminist Economists. So Abina, can you hear us? And if so, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, then we'll have Marcello also discussing François' presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I just have to make a couple of corrections that I'm no longer Vice Dean of the Faculty of Social Studies, and I'm the President-elect of the International Association for Feminist Economics. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation in terms of methodology, but I'm going to be looking at it in terms of implications that it has from a policy perspective, where we know that governments and policymakers are increasingly interested in whether their growth-enhancing measures benefit the poor. And indeed, what this paper does is present to us a tool to determine whether, what this paper does is present to us the growth incidence curve, which is a tool that can be used to do this. And we find that it does matter whether the growth incidence curves are derived using cross-sectional data or whether they are derived using panel data. And this raises the first issue, and this is the fact that in many developing countries, we don't have panel data. In Ghana, we've just got one, and you could say, and we've just got one, and I think it's recently been updated. But then we find in the analysis that you present, I think we can get around this problem by the synthetic panel. So the synthetic panel may be a way for us to get around this limitation that in developing countries, we don't have enough panel data to conduct this analysis. Now, the non-anonymous growth incidence curve, which is based on the panel data, it tracks individuals and it tracks households over time, making it possible for us to gain insights into the proportion who would remain poor, gain insights into the proportions who become poor, and to gain insights into those who move in and out of poverty. And again, for from a policy perspective, we find that this is important for the design of policies. Although indeed, when this analysis that we have looked at focuses on the mobility and dimensions of the non-anonymous indifference curve. And as I looked at your slides and I listened to your presentation, I was intrigued by the graphs that you have after averaging. You find that the ranking doesn't change very much. It's pretty constant. Now, this is data for the United States of America, and I was wondering to what extent this would also be applicable to the developing country context. So I don't know if this is something that you could throw some insight into. Then again, most of the data that we have is looking at households. Our data on poverty and inequality is household level data. But then again, I've been being introduced, being the president-elect of the International Association for Feminist Economics. I'm also interested in the gender dimensions. And to what extent, especially because most of this data is household level data, we don't have much individual level data, although of course the data that you presented to us, I believe, is labor income data for the United States, which then allows us to have an individual level dimension. But again, from the perspective of the developing country context where we don't have much in the way of labor income data, especially where we have a very large informal sector, then again, that raises another data consideration. Although if we want to have a gender dimension to it, insofar as we know that there are differences between households headed by women and households headed by men. That could be one way in which we could try to tease out any gender dimensions of government and policy using this particular analysis. So I'd like to say thank you very much. I found the presentation very interesting, and these are the insights that I'd like to present for now.
Thank you so much, Abina. Maybe we'll have Marcello's questions coming immediately after, and François, you can answer both set of questions immediately. So Marcello, you were a member of government in Brazil, currently director of the Center for Social Policies at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. And without further delay, you can have your remarks.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a great pleasure to be here. I received a gift. This lecture will be very good for my students. So you're saving my time. I cannot match your style of presentation. So thank you very much. I think the presentation shows us how to evaluate social welfare using cross-sectional, true longitudinal data, and also a part that you skipped on the synthetic panel. It's very relevant and exciting the way you presented this paradox, two curves showing completely different results, and then how you deal with that. And I can see, so for me, it's a privilege to see this new knowledge in the making. And I could see here in the communications between ourselves, people think, oh, how do I apply to my country and things like that. So I think it doesn't get much better than this. My questions are the following. First, you have this decomposition on the inequality side. You also had the growth side, at least in the previous slides, and the mobility side. Of course, growth depending on inequality aversion, and the mobility effect may be depending on risk aversion or some temporal comparison. So how these preferences across time and across distributions, inequality related, will affect our conclusions if you do a more parametric thing. Second thing is you are able to measure using this approach the true distance from Pareto improvement, not only under the veil of ignorance, but know how far we are in practice from a true improvement, or no one gets worse. You know, in the course of setting these keynotes, you were very generous. You presented us various possibilities. This was only one of them. And the other topic, you have a very pioneer and seminal work, is on globalization of inequality. How this non-anonymous growth curve, you know, how does it change, for example, the conclusion of the so-called elephant graph of Branko Milanovic, or the serpent graph of Ravalion? You know, how you know, these things can affect our evaluation on how global social welfare has changed in a certain period. I want to take advantage of your pioneer work on global inequality. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Okay.
François, thank you so much. Maybe if I can just add one question. I was surprised by the downward slope at the very bottom of the distribution in the US, and the shape of the slope. And is it also because of migration and the fact that some new people might replace poor people at the bottom of the distribution, so that they mechanically move without their absolute situation having being improved in the process? So maybe it's just a relative improvement, but not an absolute improvement, due to the fact that in the panel period some new people have arrived. So I'd like you to comment on that. And I don't know, François, if you managed to see two questions by David Lam and Hamidou Diallo in the chat. If not, I will phrase them afterwards. But François, you can start answering the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Abina and Murray and you, Thomas, for those questions. Very quickly, I mean, on the point made by Abina about developing countries and the fact that panel data are scarce in developing countries, I'm not sure it is true. Basically, because you know that the new, it's not that new, but the methodology for household surveys and the sampling of household surveys, these are rotating samples, meaning that in general, a household will remain in the sample for 1 or 2 years. And because of that, you have partial panel data. And the point about synthetic panels would be really to try to use this very limited information that we have on mobility from that part of those standard quote unquote cross-sectional panels, which include some panel data, and to exploit this panel dimension of the sampling technique for household surveys to get an idea about the role, about the mobilities or rank mobility, and then to use that in order to construct the synthetic panels. So taking fully into account the change in the two cross sections. So this is something that is being developed. Several people in the World Bank initially have done work on these too, are working on synthetic panels. I didn't want to get into that in this presentation, basically because it was a bit more technical and I didn't have time. But something is possible. And I don't think that we simply have to wave our hands and say we cannot do that. The fact that the ranking, when we were averaging, the ranking of various situations is not changing, is, I'm not sure about what will happen in developing countries. I don't have enough experience with panel data in developing countries to do that. And moreover, it is true that in developing countries, the panel available very often, as I just said, are on a very short period. Here we have 10 years. So in 10 years, you have a lot of things going on, and you may have a little less of year-to-year shocks. So I cannot answer that question. And finally, about household versus workers, labor incomes are being observed in household surveys. I mean, you have in household survey, everybody in the household is being asked how much they earned over the last month or something like that. But you can do the same kind of analysis. You can do it with households. But then you have, of course, an issue which is changes in the composition of the household. So it is not clear that the concept of longitudinal welfare is completely applicable to households, basically because of those changes in the composition. And for example, when you have a separation within the household, what do? So you'd like to be able to follow, for example, the woman with a child when getting separated, what is happening to her. But in order to do that, then you have to make assumptions about what was her lot when she was living with somebody else. So this is asking a little more than that, but this is a line of research. Marcelo, thank you very much for your support. On the risk aversion story, I think that it is quite important to make a distinction between evaluating welfare on an ex post basis and on an ex ante basis. So risk aversion would be really playing a role on an ex ante basis. If I am in some rank in the distribution, then it is true that when I'm evaluating my future, I have to take into account not only the expected position I will be in next year, but I also to take into account the risk and the distribution of that next rank. So I didn't work on this. There is a part of the literature on the social welfare applied to longitudinal data, which deals with that, but it is of no relevance in the exercise I have shown. On the Pareto improvement, yes, you're right. I mean, to some extent, we are trying to see whether there is something resembling a Pareto improvement. But as a matter of fact, we go beyond that. We simply take into account the fact that somehow it is true that $1 more to poor people is better than $1 more for rich people. And the last criterion that I've shown about the proporeness of growth is really about this. To apply that to a global distribution, it's funny because the first time I introduced non-anonymous growth incidence curve after other people like Michael Grimm and Philip van Kerm was taking countries as my statistical unit and following country over time. Whether this kind of analysis could reverse the elephant curve, I don't know. But by the way, and this is an interesting point, if you look at the elephant curve, which says that income has grown very fast for poor countries or middle income countries, China in particular, and also for the top people in advanced countries, this is the elephant curve. Then if you repeat that exercise, not from 1988 to 2007, which was the Lackner-Milanovic study, but you do it for 10 years later, then you don't find anymore the elephant curve. So this means that you have shocks. And what do you do with those shocks? How do you handle those shocks? It's not completely clear. And finally, on the Thomas' remark on migration, migrants are not there. I mean, if you look at, when you look at one period, I mean, if you look at panel data, you look at one set of people in 1 year and the same people 10 years later. Now, in between, some people have entered the full sample of the panel, but not the cohort that you are following. So because of that, if you want to take migration into account, it is another story. I mean, you'd like to see the way in which over time, those mobility statistics would be changing, in particular because at some stage in your cohort, you will have people who have entered the country recently, and there will be the people that you'll be following. But to put the spotlight on them is not easy.
Thank you, Francois. We have 4 minutes left, and we have a question by David Lam on short-term mobility. Maybe David, if you can turn on your mic and.
Well, yes, thanks. Hi, Francois. A fantastic paper and presentation. I want to get way deeper into it. But my question was just about this issue about the fact that people with low incomes are more likely to move up, and you were mentioning measurement error, and I wanted to raise the issue of transitory versus permanent income and regression to the mean. And so to some extent, this is real, and to some extent it's measurement error. And we'd want to distinguish between those two. So if you're seeing just, this is about transitory income, then this is it's really true that people with low income tend to be more likely to move up and people with high income tend to be more likely to move down. And do we want to abstract away from that, or do we want to kind of include it in the analysis? So your 5-year averages deal with that, kind of move closer to permanent income. But I guess the question is, which thing should we be more interested in? And I don't think we want to attribute it all to measurement error. Some of it, maybe most of it, could actually be a real kind of regression to the mean.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Nice meeting you. Nice seeing you.
Likewise.
No, this is a very good point. I mean, I'm not completely clear about this. The prime issue of the regression to the mean is the fact that if you have it during a period of 5 years, then maybe we have to look at another period. I mean, but you're right in the sense that we may be, okay, let me put it another way. When we model the measurement error, very often we simply say, and this is what is being done in the averaging. We're basically saying that the error will be disappearing because we are averaging over several years. Now let's assume that the error process is not white noise. The error process has some memory, which means that we are not sure that this is a measurement error. You have some deviation from a given long-run path of your income, and it takes time to go back to your path. In that case, averaging will not do it. You still have something, and you still have some regression toward the mean taking place. The only thing is, as I was saying before, 5 years may be too long or maybe too short, depending on the memory of the shock that we are looking at. But you're right in the sense that by averaging, we are eliminating shocks with some memory at the same time as we're eliminating errors with no memory. And so you're right. And in the paper, we are developing a technique to take that into account. In particular, when we're constructing synthetic panels, we take that into account. But this is a good point.
Thanks.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, David. I'm sorry we have to end the discussion. I had promised to close the panel at 6:15, and we have reached our time limit. I don't know, Paul, if you want to say a few concluding words, but again, I'd like to thank IUSSP and most warmly thank Francois, Abina, and Marcello for their time and effort. Paul, if there, oh, and I'd like to apologize to Amidou Diallo and Professor Shashikant Kumar as well. We were not able to answer the two questions. Really sorry about that, but again, had promised to close by 6:15. Oh, François, you have one last comment.
Will I be able to get those questions afterward? Because then I can reply directly to those.
Sure, we can do that.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you so much, François.
Okay, thanks.
Bye, François, and bye to everyone. And Paul, if you want to say a last word, I know for IUSSP, but thanks again for participating.
Bye,
Okay.
François.
Bye.
Thank you all for your participation. And yes, I just want to say there's another set of sessions in about an hour, I think. And those will be concluding the conference. I hope you will all be able to come back later on during the coming month to see the remaining papers that you didn't have a chance to see up to now. Oh, it's in 30 minutes, not 1 hour. Okay, in 30 minutes. Okay, well, thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.